The original PC version of Mafia quietly appeared on store shelves in the dog days of 2002's summer, and it became one of the year's best action games. Though it superficially resembled some sort of 1930s-era Grand Theft Auto, Mafia was a story-driven game featuring excellent on-foot shooting action as well as surprisingly realistic driving sequences and overall an incredibly convincing atmosphere. A year and a half later, a PlayStation 2 port of Mafia has finally arrived. It doesn't skimp on the game's mature content, but playing this version of the game is roughly equivalent to watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy on a small black and white TV VCR combo as opposed to on the silver screen. Given that Mafia was expressly designed to push PC hardware to its limits, it's no surprise that the PS2 version lacks a certain level of polish. But because of this shortcoming, along with longer loading times, it comes off like a mere shadow of the original. It's certainly not a bad game on its own merits, but there's still a far superior version of it already available, for cheaper as well. Like the Grand Theft Auto games, Mafia features a large clockwork city that you may theoretically explore at your leisure, either by car or on foot. The game can seamlessly switch between driving and shooting sequences, and should you sustain too much damage to a vehicle you're driving, you may get out and carjack some unlucky soul for his or hers. The superficial similarities pretty much end there. Unless you're playing one of the game's supplemental free ride modes, you probably won't be joyriding around the Prohibition-era Chicago-style city of Lost Heaven, which is where the action of the game takes place. For one thing, the early automobiles featured in this game just aren't much fun to drive. They're clunky, have poor brakes, and turn poorly. For another thing, much like in The Getaway, the seeming open-endedness of the game world is really just to give atmosphere to an otherwise completely linear, mission-based game. In Mafia, you play as Thomas Angelo, who starts out as a taxi driver but soon gets involved with the mob. The story is told in retrospect. In the late 30s, Tommy is confessing the events of his sordid past to a detective in exchange for witness protection. In the PC version of the game, the story unfolded via lengthy cutscenes rendered using the game's impressive 3D engine. On the PS2, these cutscenes have been rendered out into videos, and they don't look quite as good as they used to. The characters' faces can be very expressive and the motion-captured animations look great, but the characters' hands are stiff like mannequins and their eyes just stare blankly. Nevertheless, the cutscenes still look pretty good overall. The PC version of Mafia presented a surprisingly detailed simulation of what it might be like to drive around on old streets and old cars. You needed to obey traffic laws, not exceed the speed limit, stop at red lights, things like that, or else cops might pull you over and write you a ticket. Since the driving in the PS2 version generally feels so tedious, the sequences have been streamlined somewhat, with more lenient traffic laws, and you can now go faster without getting the cops on your tail. In any case, it's pretty easy to navigate the city thanks to the presence of a map that you can instantly switch to, which shows where you are and where you're headed. The game's occasional chase sequences are interesting since they're chase sequences in lousy old cars, but they're not particularly enjoyable, and neither is the driving from point to point. Still, Mafia allows you and your cohorts to at least shoot while driving, which is a nice touch. Unfortunately, due to the limitations in the control and graphics, the shooting sequences in Mafia take a pretty heavy hit as well. With the standard mouse and keyboard control missing, Mafia plays like a standard third-person shooter on consoles. Though there's a relative lack of precision inherent to dual analog stick aiming, you can at least snap to targets in the vicinity using the L2 and R2 buttons. This can take some of the pain out of the game's firefights, but on the other hand, it can make aiming a bit too easy. Still though, sometimes you'll be firing at something that you can barely see, some enemy way down on the horizon. The frame rate of the game also has a tendency to dip when the in-game action gets too heated. Though the driving sequences look pretty bland and the frame rate is pretty sketchy, Mafia certainly isn't a bad-looking game overall. As mentioned, the character models are actually quite good, and many of the animations are excellent. The audio has naturally survived the translation more intact than the graphics, and by and large it's still outstanding. The voice acting performances aren't exceptional, but they're understated and pretty natural. Ambient sounds in Lost Heaven, as well as the sounds of gunfire and of cars crashing, are all very well done. Another nice touch is that the vehicles all have authentic-sounding car horns, and you can sound your horn to make pedestrians get out of your way. Mafia's story mode features about 20 big missions, some longer than others, and once it gets going, it switches up between the driving and shooting pretty effectively. After that, there are some extras that mostly focus on the driving portion of the game, which unfortunately isn't all that fun. If you only played this version of the game, you'd still get a sense of its ambitious nature and you'd enjoy some of its finer points, but you'd also miss out on the PC version's outstandingly good graphics and its much more seamless gameplay experience. The PlayStation 2, the system, is obviously well equipped to handle certain types of games, but it's hard to imagine how a game like Mafia could have been ported to the system without some significant compromises, just like the ones exhibited by this version of the game.